The big focus today has been the elections in Zimbabwe, and there's an interesting way to look at this election. 4 of the 23 candidates, of course, we know are women, and it raises the question of the participation of women not only in this election in Zimbabwe, but indeed across the continent in all spheres, from politics to finance and even the judiciary. Well, joining us now from our C-Point studio is analyst Asanda Ngoasheng. Asanda, good evening to you. Firstly, I suppose we must start with your response to the Grace Mugabe High Court ruling this afternoon in Johannesburg.
Thank you so much for having me. It doesn't surprise me, the ruling doesn't surprise me at all, because the South African government did try and actually pull a fast one on us, because we all know that Grace Mugabe wasn't necessarily in South Africa for the SADC summit, as they were trying to prove, and she wasn't officially on the list for the summit. And so that was just the last minute rush to try and salvage a situation that was actually beyond impossible. So it doesn't surprise me that what should have happened from the word go has finally happened, that Grace Mugabe is going to have to actually account for her actions. And also it just, it's one of those things that a lot of young women have been saying, that older black women are going to have to rethink the way in which they engage with younger people. So I'm looking forward to the conversation that's going to come up in terms of how we engage with each other as women across different generations, especially when there's differences.
I mentioned in my introduction that 4 of the 23 candidates for the election in Zimbabwe are, of course, women, and it does raise the issue of the participation of women in politics. Let's take Zimbabwe as an entry point. We know, of course, 2 of the high-profile candidates, Joyce Mujuru and Thokozani Kupe, are the most prominent. Is this real participation or just a mirage?
I don't know. I think it's more of a mirage than really real participation, because real participation would lead to gender mainstreaming of policies, and it would also lead to women being seen differently. It would lead to more questions being asked about patriarchy within politics and patriarchy within society. And real participation would also lead to policies that are very clear about the position of women and very clear about things like the gender pay gap still remain, globally, but also particularly across the continent. The place of a woman is still seen as the kitchen. And if you had women who were fully participating, a lot of these conversations that we're having now would be old conversations. It should be old conversation, in fact.
We know, for example, that Zimbabwe and others in the region have signed and ratified international instruments that call for gender equality. Are they meeting those benchmarks?
All of us globally, we keep missing those benchmarks. And I think part of it is that society, obviously because of patriarchy, but society really just doesn't take women seriously, even though we do make up in terms of the global population the highest number. If you look at just even South Africa, for example, why do we have a separate ministry for women, children, and people with disabilities? Are we saying that women are equal to children, are equal to people with disability? Is femininity a disability? And why are we not pushing rather for gender mainstreaming, which means that every single department in South Africa should be thinking about women and should be thinking about how the policies that they are putting in place are going to affect women, and should be thinking about how to minimize that extra impact on women, because we know that when there's a credit crunch or an economic crisis, when there's junk status or some kind of recession as we are facing in South Africa, women become the biggest victims of that. We know there's economic oppression by men, and we know that in anything that happens in society, women almost always end up at the bottom, or almost always end up being the ones who feel its impact the most. And so if we didn't have a whole single ministry that people can point to and say, well, that's not really our problem, that's the problem of that ministry, we would be so much further ahead in South Africa. And I'm surprised that we went from, pushing for gender mainstreaming in different departments to trying to set up the separate ministry that to this day I'm still asking myself, what actually does it do?
So, look, it calls for a bigger discussion. We're going to wrap it up here because there's so much to look at, not just in politics, but in finance, in academia, in the judiciary. And also we've got to deal with this issue of women often being seen as proxies of their principles. I tell you what, Asanda, we're going to have you back with us for a bigger debate on this issue. Thank you very much for joining us. Of course, Asanda Ngoasheng, academic and political analyst, joining us from our Cape Town studios. It's certainly going to be one aspect of this election in Zimbabwe and many others around the continent that should be watched a little more closely. All right, we'll take a